All right, I want to go ahead and take a moment to step back and look at the poems and the stories that we have from last week. I want to lay out some foundational ideas on how we approach literature in this class. We're going to spend the entire semester doing this, so there's going to be a lot of different chapters and readings and videos and discussions where we kind of look at different ways to consider and delve into what we're reading. The one thing is, I know everybody gets a little excited by the idea that we're really looking at it from a standpoint of reader response. Reader response is very simple. It kind of looks at it from the standpoint of what did you get from it? What were your takeaways? Now, this is not like a means of foregoing any type of engagement. You know, sometimes I've had students in the past that'll look at a story and say, well, reader response wise, I didn't get shit from it. Right? I didn't really analyze it. I didn't look at it. I didn't consider it. I didn't think about it. I maybe kind of paid attention to it while I read through it. And viscerally, I didn't really like it. And that's it. That's the scope of their engagement with it. So reader response is not just a simple, you know, I spent 5 minutes on this and didn't like it. It really does entail some work. You still have to engage with the material. You have to have some idea of how to approach it. And that's what I want to kind of discuss today. The one aspect of it that we can start with is what's called rhetorical context. We will get into discussions of rhetoric over the course of the semester. Rhetoric typically is simply a means of arguing in either writing or speaking, right? But when we're talking about rhetorical context, the rhetorical aspect of it is the piece of writing, and the context is the situation in which it's surrounded by. And so you want to look at the rhetorical context of whatever you're reading first and foremost. You want to figure out, you know, when was it written? Who was it written by? Why did they write it? You know, what was their purpose? Were they trying to educate, persuade, entertain? And then what format did it come to? What form was it written in? Was it a letter? Was it a novel? Was it a poem? You know, was it in response to something? So there's a lot of different aspects when you kind of consider the context of a piece of writing. And if you can get into that information, it will help your analysis quite a bit. Finding out a little bit about the author. What is their background? You know, what is the other types of writing that they've engaged in? And then you can kind of get a little bit of a key to unlock, you know, where they're going with what you're reading. So that's the one aspect I would always start with is rhetorical context. As we move on, there are different types of schools of criticism. And you may or may not already be aware of this, but if you pick up a few of these and start to engage in those, then you would have a lot more tools to kind of address different types of literature. And you know, there's like a feminist criticism, you know, where people look at it from the aspect of, you know, the oppression of women through the work. And how does it kind of perpetuate or continue that? That's a whole school of criticism that people engage in. And they'll look at anything from, you know, older works all the way up to contemporary, like a new movie. They might look at that and say, I'm going to engage in a feminist critique of this and figure out, you know, is this helpful or harmful to my own ideology, right? So you can do a psychoanalytic critique, you know, kind of think about it like Freud might have and try to analyze it psychologically and break it down from that standpoint and see if you can unlock any aspect from the author or what the author was trying to present or maybe unwittingly presenting, right? You know, there's Marxist criticism where people kind of think about how the story or what's involved in the story perpetuates the ongoing, you know, struggle between the dominant class and the working class. You know, a lot of times when we look at something like Taylor Swift, for example, where you might have a Marxist reading of that that kind of analyzes how the capitalistic system kind of reinforces that type of situation. So, you know, there's postmodern critiques. There's a lot of different types of critiques, and there's no way we're going to be able to go over all of them. You know, if you know, when I was in at Sac State working on my master's, they'd have classes on various criticisms, right? They have like a general criticism class where you kind of get a introduction to a lot of different ideas, but then they have each of these other ones have their full-blown you know, deep dive into it. So, all right, let's get started. We can start with Styx by George Saunders. Now, when we start to look at something like this, we know this is contemporary. We know that this is a more recent story. And we understand the culture is like the United States culture, right? Because we're dealing with Thanksgiving and football and different ideas like that. And I guess, you look at it right from the standpoint of who is the narrator, right? So the narrator would be one of his kids. And we kind of look at what is the tone and what are they revealing within this. Now, I really like this story. I think this story is extremely powerful. Um, and even kind of catching it from the rhetorical context point of view, you look at it, the idea of what is the title of this, right? The title is Sticks. You would think, looking at the story, that this might be entitled Pole, right? Because it's about what this man does with the pole out in the front yard. But that's not where the narrator's going with this. The narrator's much more concerned with the idea of the sticks and the symbolism of the sticks, and that doesn't show up until the second part of the story. So I think it's extremely interesting. Obviously, it starts out very absurdist. It's very ridiculous at the very beginning when he's dressing up the pole to mark different holidays. And so it is almost a little, fun at that standpoint. But then there's like some dark whispers within this, right? When you see that, this was Dad's only concession to glee. It's the only time he was ever happy. This is the only thing that ever allowed him to, not be a jerk, I guess, right? Um, and then you kind of see that in the second paragraph. It says, "We left home, married, had children of our own, found the seeds of meanness blooming also within us." This story is less than 400 words. You pore over it. First time you go, okay, that's kind of a weird story. But about the fifth or sixth time that you go through it, you start to recognize these little telltale hints and find out, oh, that, every word in such a tight little story is amplified. It has a lot more meaning. It's carefully chosen. There's nothing arbitrary or haphazard set into the story. So the seeds of meanness, which the father planted in the children, were growing. And so now you're getting into the themes of growing, the inevitability of death, the fear of becoming your parents, maybe. I mean, there's a lot of this cyclical aspect of a family where the father's, struggling to communicate. He cannot communicate. The only way he communicates is the manner in which he dresses up the pole. And by the end of the story, when he puts the sticks around and then he starts writing things like, apologies, admissions of errors, pleas for understandings, right? And saying, forgive with a question mark. It's sad because he can't approach the children and say, hey, I need help to kind of, reconcile the past. Instead, he's clumsily, in his inability to communicate, just, putting them on index cards and fastening them to sticks. So again, this is really a dense story. Every one of the words is extremely specific and chosen for a purpose, and you get the tale kind of spinning through. I love it because it's so short. You can get through it a few times, and it's one of those stories that, depending on your mood, you might get something different out of it. And I think it's powerful in the manner in which it communicates. So, all right, let's go on from Styx to Taylor Swift. All right, this story is ridiculous. It's a fairy tale, right? This is a fairy tale, science fiction fairy tale where you're cloning Taylor Swift and sending her to your house and doing whatever the hell you want with her. The interesting part of this, I find right away, I look at and I want to know who is the narrator. And the narrator in this one is, no, not the narrator, the main character. The main character in this is you. You are in love. Now the narrator is the person telling the story, but the main character in this is you. So this is like a first-person adventure that I don't get to choose the ending. So it's a little bit silly in that sense. So it's a fairy tale, but it's dark as well. And you look at this and you start to think, what are you talking about, right? I mean, at first it seems kind of silly, and it's just about, having sex with Taylor Swift or cloning Taylor Swift or teaching her karate so she can beat up other Taylor Swifts. But then you have to wonder, is Taylor Swift a metaphor in this? Is Taylor Swift, an idol of consumption? Is she, working in a way that's an idealization of, what we all want to purchase, right? Again, I talked a little bit about a Marxist reading of this, and if you look at it from a capitalistic driven story where we all, it's like the pecuniary emulation where you want to have more Taylor Swifts and better Taylor Swifts, and it's a competition with the other person. The thing about it too, if you look at it from a standpoint of a feminist critique, You know, you're talking about an extreme objectification of women, obviously. Although, you know, the fact that Tina, your best friend, owns a Taylor Swift, then it's women objectifying women. You know, this still goes into that feminist critique aspect of how women are being objectified and oppressed, right? But the interesting aspect of it too is me as the main character. What sex is the main character? Because it's going to change depending on who's reading it, and it's not really tied down to any one gender, right? And so you do have fluidity within the main character's gender. So um, I think it is an interesting story. I think that it can be viewed in a lot of different ways. I think you can break it down from a capitalistic standpoint, a feminist reading from it, kind of a what is the writer trying to communicate about me or you know my society and our perceived habits in regards to purchases or commodification. So I think it's kind of interesting in that standpoint. Um, all right. I guess it could also be the dangers of fame. You know, at what point do you transfer from a person to a product, and the objectification, loss of humanity in regards to Taylor Swift, poor Taylor Swift. All right, let's move on. The next one is an E. E. Cummings poem. Since feeling is first, who pays any attention to the syntax of things will never wholly kiss you. Holy to be a fool while spring is in the world. My blood approves, and kisses are a better fate than wisdom. Lady, I swear by all flowers. Don't cry. The best gesture of my brain is less than your eyelids flutter, which says, we are for each other. Then laugh, leaning back in my arms, for life's not a paragraph, and death, I think, is no parentheses. Now, we get right into the rhetorical context of this, and E. E. Cummings is a lost generation poet. He was hanging around with, you know, Faulkner and Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ezra Pound and all of those people. So it is interesting in that sense because you have to kind of understand where he's coming from, a product of World War I, given up on everything in regards to society. Right, they're breaking away from conventions. The Lost Generation was really upset because they saw, you know, the World's Fair. They saw all of this scientific movement and all this greatness as a potential, and instead we kind of used all of this new technology and science to kill each other in much more hideous ways, right? World War I was extremely awful. And so they defied all conventions. They wanted to break away from society. Many of them expatriated themselves out of the United States and moved to France, right? Um, and so the only thing they were concerned about was love. That's all that they were be in love. That's the best thing that you could possibly be. So they weren't worried about, you know, the conventions of poetry, rhyme schemes. You know, in poetry, sometimes you look at iambic pentameter or syllabic layouts within lines. They're not worried about that at all. They're looking at wordplay, extremes like holy, holy, word will never wholly kiss you, holy to be a fool. So the whole idea of holy being H-O-L-Y or holy being, W-H-O-L-L-Y, kind of playing with these different types of ideas. And so the one thing that you want is to be in love, and that's the best gesture of my brain is less than your eyelids flutter. By the way, when we read poetry, and I hope, a lot of you probably already know this, but you don't just stop at the end of the line and then go and stop at the end of the line. You just read through. Since feeling is first, who pays any attention to the syntax of things will never wholly kiss you. You still follow the punctuation, even though I know E. E. Cummings isn't really into the whole punctuation thing. So, all right. I love this poem. It's one of my favorite poems. I think it's a beautiful idea sentiment. All right, and moving on, keeping this nice and short because I don't want to drone on forever because I could talk about these things for hours. Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front. Another one of my most favorite poems. I think probably I just love the last line. I think that gets me all the time, practice resurrection. So this is a fantastic poem. It kind of starts out with how to belong within a society and still question your essence of being able to belong in that society. It starts out, love the quick profit, the annual raise, vacation with pay. Yeah, we all love that, right? But as we go on, it gets a little darker and kind of pushes away from that sentiment, right? Not even your future will be a mystery anymore. Your mind will be a punched will be punched in a card and shut away in a little drawer. I don't want my mind to be shut away in a little drawer, right? That's terrible. And so it starts out with this, yeah, society's great, it's gonna be beautiful, you're gonna have a full-time job, you know, all of that. And then you kind of work your way down, and all of a sudden you're being afraid to know your neighbors and being afraid of dying. Right? That's not how anybody wants to live their life, I wouldn't think. So he kind of takes a turn. So friends, every day do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing, take all that you have and be poor. Love someone who does not deserve it, denounce the government and embrace the flag. Hope to live in a free republic for which it stands. So we're kind of turning it on its head and moving forward in a more, like I said, it's belonging in a society, but being able to question how you belong in that society and how you're going to participate in that. You know, plant sequoias. Say the main crop is the forest that you did not plant, that you will not live to harvest. And this makes me think of, you know, some of the Buddhist teachings that were kind of getting into the idea of wanting to plant trees whose shade you'll never sit in. So I don't know, I kind of think that's cool. Anyway, that's just a real brief discussion of the stories and the poems that we have from week 1. Interested to read over your thoughts. I know it's kind of weird in the timeline, but I'm going to go back and read all of the things that you guys wrote in the discussion board for these. Probably participate in the discussion board as it gets going. Appreciate your time. Thank you.